Hi there, guys. Today we are doing our remote lesson and our last lesson on classical Greece. Just like last time, I'm going to type up some questions associated with this lesson so that I know that you watched it or at least had to look up the responses. That's important stuff to me because classical Greece is both a really fascinating time period and it's really fundamental to a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about going forward in our class. So make sure you're ready to know the material that I'm going to go over. Alrighty. Okay, so in the 490s and 480s BCE, oh, sorry, I forgot to do my underlines here. So the Persian Empire invaded Greece. Um, which was, as we've discussed, as you should have in your notes on the Persian Empire, to punish a rebellion on the edge of Persia. But the Greeks succeeded in defeating the Persians. The Greeks were able to gain victory over much larger Persian empires, both at the Battle of Marathon in 490 and at the battles of Salamis and Plataea in the 480s BCE. And what happens is Persia more or less goes back home to kind of lick their wounds and heal, and they're going to not come back. They'll stay meddling in the affairs of Greece for another 100 years or so, but they never invade Greece after that second defeat. Now, the period after the Persian invasions is what we tend to call the classical Greek period because of the important stuff that happens in Greece during this time period. This is the stuff that you still live with today. You're going to see some familiar names. You're going to hear some familiar concepts as I go forward, and that's because we're talking about foundational stuff for what we now call Western civilization. If you're wondering what's Western civilization, stuff that's based around Western Europe, based around Britain, based around France, based around Italy, based around Greece, that's us. So your society that you've grown up in, if you grew up in the United States, is considered to be Western civilization. All right. After the Persians go down, Greece doesn't really face a lot of outside threats. The only people fighting the Greeks are other Greeks. And so a lot of these poleis, plural, go back to what they had been doing before the Persian invasion. And it won't surprise you, if you were there for our lesson on Athens and Sparta, that most of the major achievements of this time period are going to come out of Athens. The Athenians are the ones who are going to be doing most of the moving and shaking of this period, and you do need to know that. Basically, everybody we're going to talk about in this class today is Athenian. Okay, philosophy, which is the study of life, how to best live, begins in the classical Greek period. I've reordered class since I made this lesson, but you talked about Eastern philosophies, specifically the Chinese ones, in our religions micro unit. The big three Greek philosophers whose names you have to know scratch that, sorry, are Socrates, that's Socrates, by the way, not Socrates, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And if you're wondering the learning stuff, Socrates taught that humans learn best by asking questions. That is the Socratic method. You learn by asking questions. Plato, I had planned on having y'all watch a video, but then I forgot we had the teacher workday, which threw off my timing. Plato is a guy, he writes down all of Socrates' stuff, and perhaps more importantly, Plato also comes up with a lot of important philosophical concepts. The idea of the realm of forms, where everything is perfect. The idea that philosophers should be running the countries, that the best king was a philosopher and the best philosopher should be king, more or less. And then there's Aristotle, and Aristotle and Aristotelian reasoning are a lot of what we do in our day-to-day life. Aristotle believed that all learning came from observing what you could see around you. So for Aristotle, it wasn't enough to just say, nope, that's just the way it is. He had to actually be able to see it. Now, he drew a lot of really incorrect conclusions based upon what he could see, because he didn't have stuff like microscopes and telescopes. But whenever you go, okay, I need to see proof, you're doing Aristotelian reasoning. And whenever you say, okay, the only way I'm going to learn is by asking, that's Socratic logic. And all of that centers around these guys. Okay, Greek buildings were made of marble. A lot of them were. They were supported by columns. And if you're thinking, I've seen stuff like that in the United States before, yes, you have. Most of our major governmental buildings and monuments in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, obviously the White House, the Capitol, those are designed to look like Greek buildings. And they've influenced builders really around the world for a long time, for millennia. Greek statues would portray the human form as realistically as possible, and a lot of artists would follow Greek art. Now, this picture is convenient because a guy named Phidias of Athens conveniently sculpted some statues, realistic-looking statues, to support a building in columns, which means I only have to use one picture instead of two. But you can see the garments that are being worn by those women in that statue clearly have folds in them. They look like real ladies. They don't look like the drawing on a bathroom door. And that's a big deal. That actually makes a lot of artistic sense, and it's going to have a long-term tradition. So make sure that you know Greek buildings made of marble supported by columns, and Greek statues designed to portray the human form realistically. They're not abstract, they're very real. All right. My personal favorite, and I don't have time to really go into the stories that I want to, but Greek festivals, specifically to the god of wine, Dionysus, and yes, they had a whole god for that, came to feature playwriting competitions. And the Greeks only had two genres of play: tragedies, which would show a great figure's failure or fall from grace, and comedies, which are generally funny, and a lot of which, even though they were written a long time ago, are not school appropriate. The Greeks had a surprisingly dirty sense of humor in a lot of cases. Um, and while people had been telling stories for as long as there have been people, classical Greece is the first civilization to actually create structured performances, to actually have rules for how you are supposed to do a performance. And basically every form of media that we look at today still uses some of those attributes, still uses some of the pieces, if you will, of Greek theater. They are the first ones to use a scene. They're the first ones to use a chorus. They're the first ones to have people talk. Now, I'm not saying you would enjoy a Greek presentation. If you're curious about this sort of thing, there actually is a great reenactment of a Greek play called Oedipus that is available on YouTube. I can send you the link if you'd like it, if you're interested. But it's about an hour long. It features a lot of random screaming, and the moral of the story is you should not kill your dad and marry your mom. Actually, the moral of the story is you can't escape from fate, but I definitely got your attention. So if you're interested in that, I can send that to you. I don't think there's anybody who acts out Greek comedies, but I can send you the text to some of those. They are amusing. All right, math. I know, math makes me itchy too. Okay, Greek mathematicians create the foundations of a lot of mathematical principles. A guy named Euclid is generally considered to be the father of geometry, studied shapes a lot. A guy named Pythagoras, who probably is ringing a bell in your head because you've heard of the Pythagorean theorem, introduced the Pythagorean theorem to Europe. Now, you will notice And by the way, you need to know Euclid, you need to know Pythagoras. I'm not going to drag you through the other stuff about them. You just need to know Euclid, father of geometry, Pythagoras, Pythagorean theorem. But I am going to talk about this because it's too good of a story for me to ignore. And you're on a slideshow about math. What better? What better do you have? Um, the reason why I put an asterisk there, and the reason why I said Pythagoras introduced the Pythagorean theorem to Europe, is that Pythagoras did not discover the Pythagorean theorem. Babylon had discovered the Pythagorean theorem. There's evidence China did. India definitely did. And Pythagoras just happened to get his name attached to it. Pythagoras also started an honest-to-goodness math cult that you really need to look up because it is the funniest thing that I can think of right now. The Pythagoreans, their cult, could only wear white. They were not supposed to have special friends, if you catch my meaning. And my personal favorite, they were not allowed to eat beans. No beans in the Pythagoreans. You cannot eat beans if you want to be a part of Pythagoras' math cult. There are other Greek mathematicians who would like calculate the height of the pyramids. One successfully got the circumference of the Earth correct down to like a couple dozen kilometers. And they develop a few of the basics of algebra, which we will later see Muslim scholars turn into the form of math that you and I know and hate. There's other Greek influences. Here we have another realistic statue. Obviously, he's not wearing any clothes. Um, The Greeks developed early theories of medicine. Now, you would not want to go back in time and have a Greek doctor operating on you for a lot of reasons, but at least they were trying. They also hold some of the first international athletic events, the most famous of which are the Olympic Games. And you'd be surprised who participated in some of these. Remember Plato, that philosopher we mentioned a few slides ago? Plato wasn't his real name. Plato actually translates in Greek as broad-shouldered. He was a wrestler first before he became a philosopher, which I think is pretty cool. Um, the other things that you see, the Olympic competitions, running, discus throwing, javelin throwing, all done naked. Kind of a celebration of the human form, minus one, which was done in full plate armor. It was a run, like a half-mile run in full plate armor. I would not like to have done anything to do with the Greek Olympics. So now that we've looked at the areas of Greek influence, which you do need to have at least some concept of, let's go and look at how Greek influence spread. Okay, there are two major ways that the Greek culture spreads throughout the world. One is colonization. The Greeks colonized all over um, the areas that you see there in blue. They established what's called Magna Graecia, what's that translate to in Latin? Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, that's it. And they colonized the Mediterranean Sea, they colonized the Black Sea, they spread their influence far and wide, and that influence stays in place for a really long time. In some places, it's still visible today. The other major way that the Greeks spread their culture was through the conquests of Alexander the Great. We'll talk about him in a little bit. He's created this absolutely mammoth empire, this huge imperial state. Man, I forgot to do this one underlined too. Okay, so the classical period is ended. Ooh, try drawing that line where I'm not marking through it. The classical period is ended by a conflict called the Peloponnesian War. I'm not going to have you write the dates, but put simply, Athens and Sparta fought this massive war against one another. And this war was really, really just there was the ultimate winner of the Peloponnesian War was Persia because, well, while they didn't get to conquer Greece, ha ha ha, we made you destroy yourselves. Because Persia was sending money and weapons to the Spartans to try to get them to defeat Athens. The polis go back to fighting one another. And Greece more or less goes back to the pre-classical era. There is no democracy. There's no major intellectual achievements. It's just kind of there as bad as that sounds, that's about the best way to put it. So that's the end of the classical period, but Greek influence is still going to be spread far and wide by Alexander the Alright. Okay, so in the 300s BCE kingdom just to the north of Greece, you can see it on this, and if you were to click backwards, some other maps, called Macedonia, successfully takes over Greece, and then it's King Alexander III, later known as the Great, who was younger than me when he died, so that should give you an idea of how awesome he was. Alexander successfully conquers just an unbelievable chunk of the world. He invades and destroys Persia. He defeats the Persian Empire. And his empire ultimately goes from Greece all the way to India. Alexander's soldiers were probably the first Europeans to see elephants. They were the first soldiers to see, or the first Europeans to see the Himalayas. They were not happy by that point. They had been marching for years and demanded that they turn around and go home, but they did see them. Alexander died young, and after his death, his empire split into 4 states, which would all stay Greek for quite some time. You have the Bactrian kingdom, which kind of melted and blended with its neighboring states, and a lot of the Bactrians were ethnically Greek, but they dressed like they were from India, and they practiced Buddhism, and it's really cool. And then others remain a more traditional Greek vibe. Greek culture would stay the central culture throughout the entire region of Alexander's empire, really until the rise of Islam 900 years later. Yeah, the Romans are going to come, they're going to conquer some stuff, they're going to own a lot of what you see up there, but they never undid Greek culture, they adopted it. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to see and consider there. Okay, so eventually these Greek states do go into decline. Whether because you're a Greek colony and you're now cut off from the mainland, or you're a Greek, Greek successor state finally being invaded by either the Sassanid Persians or by Muslim forces from the Arabian Peninsula or by the Romans, these places do go into decline. Their political independence slowly but surely came to an end, but by the 100s BC, or excuse me, CE, Greece is going to be a part of Rome, which is Europe's new superpower. And we're going to talk about the Roman Republic slash empire slash influence over the course of our next 3 lessons. Hopefully that was at least somewhat entertaining to you guys. Thanks for sticking with, answer the questions, and I will see you in the future.